Hello there. Today I've got a treat for you on this video. I'll be having a chat with a long-time friend of mine, Keith Conradi, KC. We were instructors together on the Hawk at Valley, flying tap weapons instruction, and qualified flying instructors, QFIs. So we're going to talk about some of our shared experiences, but most importantly, for the first 30 to 45 minutes, we'll be talking about flying the F4. It's keenly awaited for DCS. So let's find out from the real deal how we fly the F4. And later perhaps we'll be speaking to Keith about his AAIB experiences, other flying experiences, but also how the Royal Air Force operated the flight. Before we start then, a formal start, what did you discover that was new about the F4 when you did your little bit of research before we did this?
I think I hadn't really ever understood the history, how long it had been in service. I mean, I was there right at the end, certainly the end of the RAF stuff. But I hadn't realised, it was sort of conceived back in the late 50s. And then I started reading about, I knew it had been out in Vietnam, and I found out a lot more about the ground attack side of it because I was only ever involved in the air defence. And so that was quite interesting just to see how it had been used. I'd always wanted to fly off the carrier. I never got the chance to do that. And it was really interesting to see some of the pictures and listen to the guys who did fly it on and off the carriers. My goodness me, that must have been entertaining. Yeah,
absolutely. And I think it's got a massive history, hasn't it? The whole ground attack capability was one of the first, or even a multi-role capability, I think, back in the Vietnam times, wasn't it? And the guys could swing from one role to the other as they did it, which leads me on to a quick question before we do any kind of formal introduction and so on. Before I forget to ask the question, did you guys have any leftover capability? I know you probably didn't practice it, but if someone were to hang some weapons on and you made the right switches, would something have happened? Did you have any symbology or facility that was still there?
Yeah. I think there was some. What was kind of seems very surprising was that there were a whole load of switches, particularly in the rear seat, that we didn't really know what they did. And there was a particular switch, and it was called a consent switch. And we'd been flying around for years with this thing. Nobody ever touched it. And then a mate of mine, they're out over the North Sea somewhere, and for some reason they had the master arm switch on in the front. And they decided to press this consent switch and had this boom, and drop both the fuel tanks. I think it was the only aircraft within the whole of the squadron's fleet which was actually wired that would have still been active. But I think it was a hang-up from the ground attack days in delivering ground bombs or whatever you guys used to do. But yeah, we lost a couple of drop tanks as a result of that one.
Well, I suppose that's what they were designed for, but not intended for use then. So cool, that's interesting. So I'd love to find off air who that was.
He's no longer alive, but yes. That was the other thing about it. It was not an easy airplane to fly, and we did lose quite a few. And I lost quite a lot of friends and colleagues during that time, mostly through handling problems with the aircraft.
Well, okay, so that probably will lead us on to some of the formal sort of questions I've got for you, Keith. But first, let's make a start then. So, really, an introduction in terms of what we're doing here. We're looking to transcribe, as we've discussed, and really just an intro for some of the guys that are in my online flying group. We're all looking forward to this F4 coming out. It is proper old school. It's coming away from a lot of the simulation modules, which have got fly-by-wire, MFDs, and what I call the kit babies don't have any problem with navigation, don't have any problem with dropping any weapons because it's so modern and easy. So it's very different is what I think people are looking forward to. So I'm hoping you as our expert, you can tell us a little bit about the F4. So who are you and why do we know each other and what's your background?
Yeah, I'm Keith Conradi and I joined the Air Force in early 80s. I went through my training quite happily, and then was sent to the F4, went to the OCU at Coningsby, and I did a tour on the F4 and ended up with about 700 hours, which I think was probably fairly typical for a tour on fast jets in those days. Swapped over to the F3, the Tornado F3, stayed at Lucas where I had been, moved squadrons, and did another tour there, and then went to become a QFI and a tactics instructor at Valley, where I met UCAM, and did a tour on the Hawk. And so left the Air Force after about 13 or 14 years, 3 tours, about 3,000 hours, terrific fun, and still had plenty of time to go and do more careers, which I subsequently did, flying civil airliners and then working for the Air Accident Investigation Branch. And then a little foray into the medical side for a little while. But I suppose flying is really my stock in trade and what I would always sort of fall back on if anybody asks, what did you do in life?
Yeah, and you kind of understate your experience within the AIB, but we'll touch upon that another day, I think, because I think that would be a very interesting chat, and let's see if the guys are interested as we go. So the role of the F4 for you when you were at Lucas, what precisely was the role? Can you tell us about that?
So, yeah, the RAF operated the F4 in both the ground attack and the air defence roles. They operated it in Europe and in the UK, and operated, I think, primarily 3 different versions of the F4. So the ones that I flew were it's called the FG1, and these were ex-Royal Navy Phantoms. We had tons of them in the Royal Navy, and then as they started to reduce the aircraft carrier fleet, they were handed over to the Air Force. And the squadron I was on, 43, were one of the first squadrons to get these ex-Royal Navy aircraft, and then used it in the air defence role at Lucas. The other types of F4, there was the FGR2, which was more a sort of one that was made for the Royal Air Force. And then there was an American version, the F4J, which was a sort of the final squadron, 74 squadron, that equipped with Phantoms, which was based at Watersham. So 3 different types of Phantoms. Ground attack was primarily carried out in Germany, working really on the front line of NATO, based, I think they were based at Wildenrath, which was pretty close to the front line with East Germany in that period. But I ended up at Lucas in the east coast of Scotland, and our work was primarily air defence. We were actually assigned to SACLANT, which I think was the Supreme Allied Commander Atlantic. So we had a sort of a maritime air defence role as much as anything else. So we did a lot of stuff working with navies, and our ship recce had to be pretty good, as well as our aircraft recce. And we were practiced day in, day out doing intercepts of aircraft and spending our time, once we were qualified, sitting on quick reaction alert and defending really UK airspace, certainly the northern part of UK airspace, of which I did many sorties, and was lucky enough, I suppose, to intercept several Soviet aircraft that were wandering into our airspace and escorting them until they were out the other side.
Coming back into the context then of this new simulation module that's coming out, the company that's producing it is renowned for producing particularly good simulation modules. And we all know how simulation goes. It doesn't always absolutely represent what the real airplane does. So mixing 2 contexts here, your experience on flying the airplane and the potential for a good simulation module, what are the sort of things from a handling point of view do you think a sim pilot should be looking for based on what you can tell them as the quirks or the things to be careful of with an F4?
Yeah, flying the F4 was really interesting and challenging. For pilots who've come off a much more conventional aircraft, and particularly the likes of ourselves who would have done our advanced flying training on the Hawk, which flew very conventionally, the F4 was very different. and primarily because it's working at high angles of attack with a swept wing, and it was really vicious. Once you got it up into the high angles of attack, if you didn't handle it correctly, it would really come back and bite you. So I suppose the big thing that I would be wanting to look out for is its handling at high AOA, angle of attack. And it's one of the few aircraft I've flown where the most important gauge in the cockpit was the angle of attack gauge. And for that reason, it used to sit up high on the windshield, actually right in your viewpoint. And all your concentration during the final part of flying a circuit, or if you were then doing certainly in an air combat regime, would be you'd be looking at this little instrument, and it was an unusual instrument because what you were looking at was it was a rectangle with a big circle in the middle and two arrows either side of it pointing towards it, and this was to tell you when you were, if you like, optimum angle of attack, which happens to be just over 19 units. It's something known as on speed, which is what you would fly your approaches at. And if you got above that, you get the little chevron above it would light up and tell you to go down towards it. And if you were below it, you'd have the other chevron. But what you were really after when flying it optimally would be to have that middle circle illuminated. And our aircraft are even more interesting because they were ex-Royal Navy ones. They had an audio angle of attack as well. And I've never flown anything else which just had an audio angle of attack. So you could actually hear this thing beeping at you. And it would beep quickly as you were at a low angle of attack. But as you got higher and higher, it would slow down and the beeps would eventually become a single tone when you reached on speed, 19 units. And that was what you were aiming for. So I think a really interesting way of looking at the simulation would be to fly a circuit in the thing and see how it performs. So if I take you come to the end of the downwind leg of a normal circuit, and you roll in to the final approach. It's what my instructor always used to call the big pull. So you'd roll this aircraft. And of course, as you know, in high speed and swept-wing aircraft, nothing happens when you roll it. You actually have to do a bit of pulling as well. And you'd roll the aircraft and you'd pull until you hit the single continuous tone. So you were hitting absolute 19 degrees. And you held it, and you held the stick at 19 degrees. And then as you rolled out on final approach, in a complete contrast to most aircraft, you now flew your height above and below glide path was all controlled now by the throttle. So you would just hold the stick to maintain 19 units. And if you were high on the approach, you take off some power. And if you were lower on the approach, you put on some power. And you didn't really even look at the speed. So as long as you were holding the right angle of attack, you just could see the runway and you just use the throttle to balance yourself on the glide path. And you kept going all the way down like that, very little flare at the bottom. And then as you touch down, you pull the parachute, which is what we normally use to brake, which is pretty effective at high speed, and then roll out on the runway. And that took a lot of getting used to from being a Hawk pilot. And also, I have to say, when I went back to being a Tornado pilot, it took a lot of used to going back the other way. And you could become so familiar with flying in this sort of regime. So flying a circuit, I think, will be a really interesting challenge to ensure the fidelity of the simulation that you're talking about.
And in fact, I think those that have used the simulation, some of the modules, they've got an F14 and the F18, and that seems to be the carrier method, the on speed, the basically at that point on the drag curve and using the power for the vertical. So hopefully, the guys, when they go fly it, they'll be used to that. So if, let's say you've overcooked the AOA, not necessarily in the circuit because we don't want to hit the ground just yet. We've overcooked the circuit, the AOA at altitude perhaps. Was the result predictable? Or did it really just go Did you get warning, and did it behave in a particular way? Did you see certain things happening?
Yeah, I mean, I suppose we did quite a bit of stall training at height, and it was reasonably predictable up to about 22, 23 units, if I remember correctly. You get a lot of shuddering. In fact, we had a little phrase: "If it shudders, use the rudders," was a little phrase that we used to use. And the key thing here, as it started to move around, was not to use the ailerons and to use the rudders at high angle of attack. And in fact, you would do that in full-blown air combat. If you were right up there at high angles of attack, you would roll the aircraft using the rudder. And this is because the aircraft suffered from a lot of adverse yaw. It was unusual in that when you roll the F4, what would happen is that the ailerons would only ever go down. So on the wing that you wanted to roll into, you wouldn't. There would be no aileron movement. You get a spoiler might come up and to destroy some of the airflow, but the aileron on the other side would go down to give you that extra lift, which was great when you were flying at reasonable speeds. But as you started to get to high angles of attack and the airflow starting to break away, effectively all that upper wing aileron, as the aileron went down, would give you a load of drag, which would then lead to adverse yaw. So you'd immediately start going the other way. So you had to be really, really careful with the ailerons at any sort of angle of attack. It was helped in the circuit, but when you had some flat down, there was an aileron rudder interconnect, so it automatically gave you some rudder if you put in aileron. But you very quickly learned that using your feet was as important, if not more important, to controlling the aircraft at high AOA than anything else.
So in fact, some of my recalls from flying the Hawk and the Tornado, basically my two types were rudders were just footrests. Even if you had an engine failure in the Tornado, you didn't need much of one. So, no. I mean, occasionally you could use it, I suppose, to help yourself increase the rate of roll in that low-speed scissors at 21 units or something. But and that description there, Keith, was textbook in as much as I seem to remember going through this stuff in our QFI course. We had to learn all these high-speed aerodynamics, and the Phantom, I recall, was one of the things they talked about, and the increasing chord angle and angle of attack on the upgoing wing, and that causes it to stall as well. Oh, crumbs! I think. I mean,
it was a real handful. So I mean, it was predictable up to a point. I think as you took the angle of attack higher, you tended to get a bit of nose slice, and the nose would come down. But usually you could correct it very quickly. You know, obviously adding some power and reducing the angle of attack to sort of 3, 5, 6, 7 would normally do the trick. You really didn't. We never spun the aircraft. Getting into a spin or getting into all those really high angle of attack and losing control was very, very difficult, as far as I'm aware, to get out of. So we really stayed away from those. But we did practice a lot of rolling the aircraft with the rudder, and lots of rudder reversal technique was the key to any sort of flying in air combat. If you found yourself in a turning fight, you were absolutely ready to use the rudders.
So would it be safe to assume in a bit of air combat, if you're in your knife fight, would you be aiming to avoid the slow speed regime, or the rudder's not an advantage, it's something that stops you stalling the aeroplane or departing the aeroplane? So would you try and stay away from there?
Yeah, I mean, I think the big advantage of the Phantom in terms of a combat aircraft, had 2 people in it, which I always think is a real bonus. And it was fast, and it was particularly at lowish levels. It was super, super fast, and had some for the time. It had a really good radar. It had a really good weapon suite, but it wasn't a turning airplane. So really, you really wanted to avoid getting into a turning fight. You might have one go and have a look, but you'd be looking to exit the fight, and it would accelerate super, super quickly. So actually, you would fly it to play to its strengths, and its strength was not getting into a turning fight.
Yeah, I recall being over the North Sea fighting with one on one of the exercises out there, and we both got slow speed, and where the chap in the Phantom had the advantage was that thrust. So when he chose to disengage, if I try and come around the corner, because we obviously only had 9 lemurs on, if I try and come around the corner after him, even though he's pushing out a bunch of heat, he was way out of range by the time I've got my nose round. So that thrust, I think, gave you guys definitely an advantage on us.
Yeah, if you used it wisely, it was absolutely fantastic, and we carried a decent amount of fuel, so that you could use that again to your strengths. And I suppose the other thing that you could use it for was to go into the vertical, because again, it was super powerful going up, especially if you weren't sort of just after takeoff. You had a greater than 1-to-1 sort of power ratio, and you could generally outclimb people. And then as they fell away, you might have a second chance as you came in back after them. But it was knowing the strengths of the aircraft, knowing what you were up against, and knowing when to bug out of a fight and return back in for a high speed sort of, and using a radar guided missile, if you could, of course, was going to be the best advantage as you came back into the fight.
No, that makes sense. So not forgetting the chap in the back seat then, a couple of questions I've got for you there. Did you have a stick in the back seat? Because obviously I recall, I think the original USAF Phantoms did or would have. Did that happen in the Royal Air Force ones?
No. We had maybe one or two stickers on the squadron, but generally, no, the guy in the back did not have a stick.
Mm-hmm. So then going on to his role as the navigator and the intercept guy, basically the radar operator. Any particular issues that the guys had with the radar? You said it was a fairly good radar for its time. Do you think it was still able to hold its own in that period?
Yeah, I think it was one of the first generation of sort of look down, shoot down capable aircraft, and that primarily came because of its pulse Doppler radar. So it certainly took a skilled navigator to be able to operate it effectively. I wouldn't say it was straightforward by any means, but if you had a good guy in the back who could see targets as they started to appear out of the noise, they were on it. And actually, it was initially a Sparrow and then a Skyflash missiles. It was a pretty effective way of dealing with a low-level threat. So you could cap at medium to high altitude and still be able to execute an attack on a bunch of low-level aircraft. And the most usual way to deal with that would be to turn sort of onto the 90, so that there was no longer any closing speed, to try and then reduce in the pulse Doppler radar. That would mean that your target blip would then fall back into the noise. But again, a crafty navigator in the back of an F4 could often pick out that aircraft and maintain the radar lock while you prosecuted the attack. So yes, nothing like comparison with today's radar, but I think for the time, introducing the pulse Doppler as opposed to pure pulse was a sort of a major step forward.
Yeah, I do recall some of the working through the Lake District and seeing F4 RHWR up ahead of us and so on, knowing that this is going to be a tough one because they're quick. Obviously, when the F3 came in, I think they had fairly good radar too. But yeah, I can vouch for that. These guys would often find us. I mean, obviously coming through the Moffat Valley or the Lake Districts and so on, they know where we're going to pop out, generally speaking. But yeah, these guys were fairly tenacious and good. And on that subject of the radar, is it coming away from kit babies again, that you've got no... I'm led to believe that it was all mental agility from you guys in the jet to engineer the correct intercept, your 180 or your or whatever kind of intercept you were going to convert to. Would that be true to say? Did you have any cues, or was it mental gymnastics?
There was a lot of mental gymnastics, a lot of manoeuvring the aircraft around, and really there's no substitute for the experience of the guys, and this is really where I think the rear seaters earn their money. I mean, navigators is an incorrect sort of way of describing them, as you know. They were really there to operate the system, and they would know normally, even if aircraft were trying to do their first evasive action, they knew that at some point, obviously, you had to come back, and they would be looking for where that would happen and generate the correct angle to be able to take the shots. We had a 60-degree sort of radar angle and because of the missiles we were flying were semi-active, we had to keep the radar painting the target throughout that period until the missile got to the target, which meant that you couldn't just fire and forget. And I suppose our usual tactic would be to push it to the edge, 60 degrees off, and then just hold it on the edge of the radar scope. The problem was the missiles, the Skyflash that we were firing, had a great initial boost. Then it had a long glide phase. And if you weren't careful, it could take forever to get to the target. You ended up almost catching the missile up so you ended up closer to the targets than perhaps you ideally would have wanted. Because as I said, we didn't really want to get into a turning fight. So it was quite entertaining playing that sort of game. And you didn't have what the Tornado brought in was this track while scan, so that you could be locked onto a target and also, of course, be looking at other targets. Once we had committed to the lock on the F4 radar, that was it. You were blind to anything else that was going on. So you really didn't want to be in that position for very long. And therefore, it made sense when you were operating with 2 or 4 aircraft, your tactics would play in accordingly, so that actually you were looking at all bases and covering each other as you went through the attack phase.
Mm-hmm. Okay, so that kind of ties in with all the stuff I remember about what you guys used to do. And this is really good because, bantering aside, I know what it would be like if a Tornado guy is talking to an F4 guy. It was all just banter and shouting loudest in the debrief, if the HUD film didn't work. And so it's always nice to hear it from another point of view without us throwing banter at each other, just to bring down our own performances. I was going to ask you some technical questions now, Casey. So I'm hoping I'm not asking you to dredge too much of your memory on the technical aspects of the aeroplane. So I do apologise, and don't think of this as a QFI check in any way. It's things like the differences in the aeroplanes, because there have been so many variations of the F4, as you say, starting with the US Air Force, US Navy, and the Royal Air Force taking on the Royal Navy jets, and so on and so forth. Direct questions. Blown flaps. Did you have blown flaps and slats for low speed work?
We had a boundary layer control system, so we had air blowing, a bit like the Buccaneer. We had it blowing over the leading edge of the wing, and I think we had some drooping as well of the leading edge. We certainly had a slotted stabilizer, which made quite a big difference compared to the FGR2. So that was good.
Okay.
Again, this was the benefit of having the ex-Royal Navy ones. And while we're on that, we also had a beefed up oleo for the nose leg. So we were automatically at a higher angle of attack as we took off and landed. So it felt fantastic. It was great to land it. You'd see these aircraft coming in and you think, wow, that's going to really smash into the ground. But these oleos were amazing. They took all that rate of descent and just converted into a nice smooth sort of finish as you hit the ground. So yeah, I really like flying the ex-Royal Navy aircraft.
Yeah, so you can definitely see its pedigree as a carrier-borne aeroplane then, with all of those factors on. And I suppose the hook as well. Do you know, because again, I have no idea on this, did the FGR2 have a hook? Because obviously you might want to take the RAG anyway for hydraulic issues, but did it have a hook?
Yep. Yeah, and I think the hook was much the same. As far as I remember, I mean, I did have to use it on a number of occasions with hydraulic failure, brake failures. In fact, I've taken the approach end and the overrun sort of cables on the runways. And in fact, while we're talking about that, we were kind of lucky at Lucas. We had a very short cross runway, which you could never land on in normal circumstances, but it had a very powerful arrestor cable on there. And it had been used previously, I think, to train people for doing carrier landings. And whenever there was a VIP coming to visit the base, we would get a request to come and do an approach and take the cable for the pleasure of this visitor. It was an entertainment sort of thing. And I did this on a number of occasions. And it was amazing because you come around the corner and you see this postage stamp of a runway ahead thinking, jeepers, what is this going to be like? But it was great because you dropped the hook and you went in and you really, it was like, I'm sure, going onto a ship, and that you were ready if you missed it to go full reheat and bolt. And we had a fast reheat system on the ex-Royal Navy ones as well, which was something that the normal RAF ones didn't have. And anyway, you'd end up in the cable, and you'd be flown forward in the cockpit, and inevitably your hands would go full military power, if not full reheat, as you were flown forward. And so you find yourself, as you sort of came to, stretching this cable that you were attached to. You come back to idle, and then the aircraft would actually end up going backwards, and it would go backwards faster than the cable would come back. And if you got it right, as you came back and you came out of the cable in reverse, you could then raise the hook, put the power on again, and then you then go forward, trample over the cable, and be able to taxi off. And you do all that within about 10, 15 seconds, much to the pleasure of the assembled guests. Yes, so that was good fun.
I remember talking to an F3 chap, again, a long time ago, because this was a long time ago for us, but I was chatting with him, and he was saying that they were all quite disappointed they didn't have a hook, because you guys used to, and that's a classic example, play with your hook, basically. Saying that, no, the F3 hook is designed purely for emergencies, not demonstrations. You don't take it as a matter of course. How true that was, I don't know, but he was certainly, aware of a time when the early F3 guys that come from the F4 had actually been using the hook when, you're kind of stretching the back of the airplane now, guys. So
I remember
times.
that as well.
Yeah.
It was just a non-event to take the hook in the F4 because it was designed, I assume, to be done on every single landing. So I mean, if you ever look up close to it, these things are huge, massive, beefy pieces of metal. So there were no special checks, as far as I remember. You just took it, came out of the cable, and moved on. It was great. It's really good.
Yeah, the few times I did take the cable, it was the approach end cable, and one of them was a practice, and the other two were issues. It was a big deal. The practice was a big deal. There's people in place ready for it, and to reset it all, and all the kit to put this puny little hook back up, which always appeared to me like it was just on a strap of metal with just some kind of cup hook on the end of it. But it still stopped the jet. But it was a big deal because it wasn't built into it. So nice one. Did you say it was your favourite type that you flew, or where would you put it in that respect?
I found it hard to get used to it. I think it took me half my tour just to become comfortable with the airplane. But by the time I finished, I was really starting to feel at one with the whole thing, and I didn't want it to end then, because I really felt so comfortable with it. So I think that last year I flew on the squadron was probably the most comfortable I'd felt with an airplane, which was a challenging airplane. I mean, it's hard to say. I mean, it wasn't comfortable to fly. It was noisy. I mean, hugely noisy. When you started it up inside a HAS, a hardened aircraft shelter, compared to starting a Hawk out on the line at Valley, I mean, this was just another world of experience. It was deafening. The thrust levers took all your strength to move them around these old things. There was nothing smooth about the whole thing. The seat was it felt like it was slightly canted forward. You had to shout to make yourself heard to the guy in the back. The view wasn't great, compared to a Tornado, and then obviously nothing compared to an F-16. So there were all these things about it which made it quite an experience, quite an ordeal sometimes. But once you felt in control of the aircraft, and then you were flying it, as you say, chasing some guys down the valleys in the Lake District, there is absolutely nothing finer. You felt you had so much power at your fingertips, all these weapons around. It was just the best feeling in the world.
And I think I can mirror that, certainly not from an F4 point of view. And I think any first tourist starts to get comfortable 2/3 of the way through. And as you recall, the Tornado, even the F3 was a Tornado, different to the GR1 in terms of role, but handling pretty much precisely the same, I would assume. And I started to feel comfortable about 2/3 of the way in, not with the flying the aeroplane, because that came really, really early because it was so easy compared to, say, something like the F4. It was the systems, because I think that was a sign of the times moving forward. We're flying with many more complex systems. And so the flying, we're not thinking about it, are we? We're just looking at how do I get these weapons on from TFR at low level at night, IMC. And those are the things I got comfortable with. And then when they said, no, you're going to go off and be an instructor, it was like, oh, I'd really like to go do this again for another tour. But as it was, the instructional job was fun. We had some good fun, and I particularly enjoyed that because we had everyone from different backgrounds, which was pretty cool on the squadron.
Absolutely. You start off with all these people who are then dispersed to all these different types of aircraft, and then you bring it back. And actually, it made for a lot of fun, didn't it, in the instructor world? And I think we probably learned a lot. I mean, I learned a lot from you guys. About dropping bombs and the way you approached all those sorts of things, and hopefully vice versa in the sort of the air combat. And it was bloody annoying. I remember doing some air combat with you, Cam, and I could not stop you from shooting me down. I was thinking, how is this possible? How is this happening? I spent all these years practicing on this, and there's this mud mover who is continually getting on my backside and shooting me. So yeah, it was a whole lot of fun.
Pure fluke. It was paid forward. I think it was an F4 guy that had taught me some bits and pieces, perhaps that, I don't know, Al or Tug or Al White, who knows, that had taught me some top tips and bits and pieces. Although I don't think I used the standard instructor F4 cheat, which was to go in below safety altitude with the taxi light off in the Hawk, and then you can deny everything. Until you pop up behind the other fella. I did have one chap confess that to me after we got back. It was an instructor SCT fight. He said, "I said, where were you? I didn't even see you." He goes, "Oh, mate, I'm an experienced F4 driver." But yeah, that was he confessed to it in the bar afterwards. That's how he'd done it. And he said, "So I'm going to say you won that one, Cam, because that was technically a base height kill when I came in too low." So it seems like a bit of a poor victory, but well, there we go.
If the guys want to do Q&A sort of stuff, when in a sort of some sort of forum, we're very happy to do that. Yes, I can't promise you I can remember things like the weight or the max thrust or some of those sorts of things, but generally I can tell you more about how to fly it.
No, the guys actually, the sort of flying group that I fly with, they, one of the points I make about it is we've got quite a few professional pilots in there. The sort of helicopter guys, the guy with, there's an actual Apache helicopter pilot. There's some British Army helicopter pilots for the little helicopter side of things. We've got some airline pilots. We've got one guy who doesn't fly so much with us now, but he did when he was going through Valley. And so the point I'm making is we've got guys that are actually interested in operating the aeroplane rather than plane spotter stuff. Which might mean we've got some leeway to not have to give out actual takeoff weights and thrusts because we can't remember them, fortunately. So it's mostly that how do we do things or how did we do things, and I'm seeing a real popularity in the Cold War stuff. We've got a server that's used for Cold War flying, which is basically the older stuff, which is where the F4 will sit in the setup. Working with other Cold War airplanes, so that it's the guys want to know how do you fly it, how do you operate it without MFDs and stuff, without all the gears.
No, fine. Well, I mean that's great because it really does feel like, particularly before the Tornado, it was a real old generation, no head-up display, a little target thing, gun sight, sort of optical sight, but even the guy in the back, Cam, I don't even know this. He had a telescope. There's equivalent of a little telescope, and so when we were trying to do beyond visual range identification type issues, if I pulled this dot into the middle of my little gun sight, even though I couldn't actually see the aeroplane, he could look through this telescope, and it might give him maybe 5 or 6 seconds extra time to have identified it, with the possibility of being able to get that headshot in and then at least scoot and shoot through the fight if it was something that we didn't want to turn with. So, yeah, I mean, it was bizarre that we had all those things that we were trying to use in those days. Brilliant.
I mean, That is proper old school, isn't it? And I think even coming onto the Tornado, obviously we had the goodie of the head-up display, but apart from being a slightly more modern cockpit and clearly a more modern radar for you guys in the F3, I think a lot of people don't seem to realise that even the GR1, which subsequently obviously became the GR4 and the F3, still fairly old school as an aeroplane. Okay, it's got fly-by-wire, but the way we operated the GR1, even though we had all this cool kit, it still didn't do everything for you. You know, the work that was done by the fella in the back to get it to the place we needed it to be, because we didn't have GPS. Again, people take that sort of thing for granted.
Yeah.
So we were fixing nav kit because the INS would go for a run somewhere, but you were still expected to deliver your weapon somehow. Whereas a lot of modern stuff, it's all integrated with GPS and it's ring laser gyros or whatever they have nowadays. So I think, we were on that, the Tornado was on the transition.
Can you imagine though, in the F4, even the inertial nav was very basic, and we were going out in that sort of Iceland Faroes gap in the middle of the night to intercept these Russian aircraft. And to be honest, we had no idea where we were, and you went up to height at some times to just see if you could paint some coastline anywhere, and you weren't sure if it could be Norway, Iceland, the Faroes, north of Scotland, and then trying to work out roughly where you are to within 50 miles might be quite nice. I mean, it was just crazy sort of time. Yeah.
In those times when you were found yourself a long way from home, after having done the bear, and then you're coming back, or you're not quite sure where you are, I'm assuming the tank would be on station for you, because your fuel calculations would mean nothing if you don't know what it's in relation to. So did you ever have to hit the tanker as a matter of urgency?
Oh yes. If you were one of the early, the Q1 launched aircraft, or the first aircraft to get out there, as you were coming back, you'd hope that the tanker was still struggling its way up, and you'd be calculating desperately how to meet it in northern Scotland to avoid having to land at Wick or some airfield which really wasn't at all suitable, but was the only place you could possibly put it down. So, yeah, and then there's a famous case of one guy who miscalculated the whole thing on an F4 returning, and he ended up throwing all his missiles away because he was worried about the drag and the weight. And so he dumped all his weapons because he didn't think he was going to be able to get back to any airfield in Scotland. Luckily, I didn't get quite that far. As you told me that.
Well, as you've just told me that, I'm just desperately looking. I've got an old songbook somewhere.
Was that
Treble 1?
Yes, that's right. It was. Yes. Yes.
In fact, I found it. I found it. No, that one. Here we go.
Of course, there was a song. It was written that night in the bar. Yes.
Do you know what? In a moment off air, I'd love to know if I knew who that was that had done that. But yeah, I found Reggie Perrins when he came to the nav school at Valley, because they were attached to us on 74. I have a copy of the F4 era songbook, typewritten, because bear in mind we're talking about 30 years ago. It's got Jagmate in there, Don't Bend Down, Top of a Jagmate, Just One Tornado. It's got all of the ones I'm sure you recognise that obviously can't really be used for public consumption without heavy redaction in the 21st century. But
it should have that one about
that song.
Yes, that's right. Throwing the missiles away. Yes, that's right.
You don't need them anyway, or something like that. Oh, that was brilliant. Well, I'm glad to know that is actually a true story and not just some made up thing, which is always quite interesting.
Completely true story. Yes, absolutely.
Well, actually, one other thing I wanted to ask you. It's something I dredged from the bottom of my memory. I think it happened. Did it happen while we were at Valley, or maybe the F4? I think it finished completely, I know, at Wattisham, everywhere else. But was there an incident once where there was a chap, it might have been an F3 actually, a chap was incapacitated in the front, but the chap in the back didn't have controls and he had to leave? No command eject. Is that a thing? Am I remembering that correctly?
It's a correct thing. It was, and I knew the two people involved quite well. I think they were on the OCU, the F4 OCU at Lucas. Two instructors went off for a trip, and the chap in front complained that he had a headache. and was starting to return home, and then complained that he was losing his vision, and eventually said he couldn't see anything, and he was shouting and screaming, and the aircraft ended up in this sort of spiral dive, and there's no command eject in the F4, and eventually the rear seater ejected, while he was still within the ejection seat limits, and very, very sadly watched the aircraft with the pilot in it crash into the North Sea. I think it greatly affected him, and it was a long time before he was able to get back flying again.
That's it's not a nice thing to happen, is it? So so again, it shows the age of the aeroplane in many respects, doesn't it? Things like command eject aren't necessarily a thing that we should ever have taken for granted on previous aeroplanes. Everything is always developed, isn't it?
That's right, and of course, I suppose we kind of did take it for granted, didn't we? It was just the way it was. We didn't even think about it. But there are quite a few accidents during my time on the F4, and mostly from handling errors. I think the F4 display aircraft had an accident at Abingdon when they didn't get high enough at the top of a loop and continue with the loop and hit the ground. And another one which, again, you ended up in a very high rate of descent, and if you didn't pick it up over the sea, it was so easy to lose that situational awareness, bang, straight into the sea. Another one in the Falklands, similar sort of thing, doing low-level air combat.
In fact, I think I knew both those guys too there, actually, on that one, the one in the Falklands. Sad loss all round, but it's the very nature of the business, wasn't it? And obviously in your AIB thing, it's not an easy thing to write down to say normal operating hazard, but I always seem to remember it used to be a thing that was written in the accident reports, certainly the Board of Inquiry reports. Again, you'll know more about this than me, how it's done and the tree of causes and reasons. But I always seem to remember many times it would say normal operating hazard, and you think that's the nature of what we're doing. That's why it's so many compared to airliners or light aircraft, I suppose.
Yeah. Well, we were trying to fly the aircraft right at the extreme of its operating capabilities, the envelope, if you like. But and we're trying to operate it and perform there, aren't we? We're actually trying to use it to get, well, in my case, to be able to shoot down another airplane. And so you couldn't just sit in the nice comfy zone in the middle. You actually had to be exploring right to the end of it to ensure that you had the upper hand and were likely to win the fight. And that would inevitably lead to some losses.
Absolutely. And in fact, when I think about it in the context of what we do now in the airline world and what you used to do when you were doing that, was we are preferring to stay comfortably in the middle of the envelope, and hairs on the back of your neck stand up when you move towards it. Just make a swift move towards the edge. We would aim for the edge of the envelope many times in the fast jet world, but nowadays, and quite rightly, we are hairs on the back of the neck because I'm going towards the envelope. I'm not there yet, but I'm going, and I don't like it. Which is shows a difference in the type of flying, doesn't it?
But I think it's interesting that you say that and recognise it, but it's so important. And I wonder if sometimes there's that person who may have flown these high performance aircraft. You've got to change that mentality so much when you come to the airline world, in terms of the safety side of it. There was a guy who I trained with in my airline who had been an ex-Red Arrows pilot, and he had a dramatic sort of change of culture, if you like, halfway through his training, because he wasn't coping with it. He would try and cut the corner, if he was flying a visual pattern of some sort. He would, if the wind was right on limits, he'd go, no, I can do this, even though maybe it was gusting outside limits. And he would be pushing it. And suddenly it was almost an epiphany. He realized, what am I doing? What am I doing this? I have 200 people down the back here. I don't need to be taking these risks. I just need to be flying it very steady and flying the patterns. No one's going to thank me if I save 10 kilograms of fuel, but then the next day pile 200 people into the sea. So yes, it does require, I think, a complete change of mindset from what we've done in our previous careers.
Yeah, absolutely. In fact, I'll brief the chaps I'm flying with. We always talk about our history and our previous experiences. It always comes up, and I'll say to them in any kind of brief we're doing that you'll think this guy told me he used to fly Tornadoes and instruct on Hawks, and now he's flying like driving Miss Daisy. You know, nope, I'm too close to my pension. You know, I've dodged a bullet this far in the aviation world. I think I'll just keep on doing what I'm doing. And I think the expertise, the stuff that we took away as fast jet pilots, and I recall this from the training side of things, it was all about capacity. It was all about dealing with the issues. It was very rarely about the pure stick and rudder in anything you do. It was, and I found that, you know, using that mental capacity, which stays the same, I don't have to do funky, cool stick and rudder stuff anymore, which inherently makes the job easier. So you're just using the same principles we had as a fast jet pilot, looking at what could go wrong, how am I going to deal with this if it does go wrong, what's likely to happen here, which fits in so beautifully with the airline world, because it's the curveballs that push us towards the end of that envelope, isn't it?
Yeah, I always think of it, and you know, when we used to do the multi-crew training, that sort of situational awareness and just getting yourself, you've looked through all the what ifs, you're aware, and you've pushed yourself way ahead of the airplane as much as you can. And in the fast jet world, you could rapidly end up right up against it. So if you hadn't pre-planned and thought out some of these scenarios, you could really be caught out very, very easily. But you do the same thing in the airline world, don't you? You know, you've thought about it. You've thought about the diversions and the fuels and the weathers and all these sorts of things. They're all there. They've all been considered without you having to do some crazy sort of pilot shit to actually save the day. So
yes, yeah, absolutely. And I think, you know, it's this whole idea of making it look effortless, because it's experience that does that. I was chatting with someone at work the other week, and we were saying exactly that, you know, that someone will come into the flight deck and you don't look like you're doing a lot, but it's all happened in the mind. It's all happened previously. And we are literally like a coiled spring, but not under too much pressure, because we've seen it all before. We've been doing it all our lives. And I think that's perhaps why sometimes the losses, again, I'm just theorizing here, the losses may be slightly higher than they should nearly have been back in Air Force days, because you are youngsters. It's not to say you're being a bit of a ripshit, but you are a youngster and you've not got that experience behind you. We've even talked about it. You know, 2/3 of the way through your first tour is when you start, right, I'm comfortable now. People will flag that occasionally as well. That's a danger point. And I remember the Air Clues magazine would say that 500 hours on the aircraft type is often the first danger point. Not to put too fine a number on it, but that's, yeah.
No, this morning I was just talking about one of the phantom losses. It was a navigator who had mentored me all the way through my initial year or two on the F4. And then him and this pilot were just going to get their 1,000-hour badge, and they changed the crews around so that they could fly together to get their 1,000 hours on the same trip. And what happened? They saw these low clouds. They went steaming through these low clouds, looking for an intercept on a Buccaneer. They weren't low clouds. They were little bags of fog that were sat right on top of the sea. Straight into the sea. Yeah. Both killed. Both trying to get their 1,000 hours.
Yeah. Sort of focusing on the wrong thing at the wrong time, in a big picture sense of view. And even 1,000 hours is relatively young pilot.
Yeah.
I would say in terms of pure experience level. You know, we did get to fly a lot compared to, let's say, our perceived enemy previously, the Warsaw Pact. You know, we used to hear tales they'd get a couple of hours a month, and you got the hog pot, I seem to remember. If you got 30 to 35 hours in a month, you were forced to drink the big pot of beer if you were the guy that got all those hours. But they accrued fairly quickly. Someone asked me the other day, how often did you fly? Every day. Roughly every day, and on the Hawk 3 times a day. I get trench foot from having my feet in an immersion suit all day. You know, but yeah. So I think even 1,000 hours on type is I don't know. You've still not seen it all, have you? You know, you see the spec aircrew guys on the squadron, dangerous. And it's very rare that they would.
That's what I always think. You know, and you have that confidence, which isn't necessarily backed up by years of experience, because you still could only been flying for a few years, and I think that was the problem. You didn't know enough to be more cautious, as it were. But you know, there's always that balance, isn't there? But it's like you're saying. I remember you could have sat in my cockpit on an F4 and F3 when I was on a combat air patrol for hours and hours on end. Sometimes, you know, nothing happening, but you're sitting there flying rectangles in the sky at 25,000 feet or something, And yet, a bit like flying your airliner now, all the scenarios have been thought about. And then when that one target then started to appear, and then there were multiple targets behind it, you put that box in that you had been considered, oof, and off you went, and you were straight into that mission focus. And so you could very quickly adapt from not doing very much at all to being in full flight mode with 4 aircraft coming down either side. You're all sorting which aircraft you're going to lock onto, and everything happens because of all the planning that's gone beforehand, the experience that you have seen these things before, you've practiced, you've got it wrong probably a few times. But by that stage, when you have that experience, you know what you're looking at, and you've considered it, and it becomes a successful attack.
Absolutely. Brilliant. And there's no substitute for experience. We just need to survive long enough to gain the experience, which is why I gradually, I just get slower and slower with everything I do. I feel I've beat the odds this far. I've beat the odds this far into my career. I'm going to continue this way.
Yes. Yeah. No, it's great fun. I've really enjoyed it, Cam. Actually, it's been super. Yeah. Thank you.
Yeah, brilliant. And normally we're sat across from on your kitchen table or mine with a beer when we do this, but we'll fix that up some other time. We'll come record in person one day.